the World Bank, I must say there's a collective sigh of relief across this town right now, because the concern coming into this week is that you were going to do exactly what you said you're not going to do, which is the U.S. would withdraw, but you want to lead. What you're asking for is simply getting back to factory settings, right? Focused approach, and deal with the issues that you see are most paramount, correct?
Correct. As I said in my confirmation hearings, I think U.S. engagement with the international financial and multilateral institutions, we should engage, and we should be in it to win it for the American people and for the rest of the countries and for the client countries.
20 years ago, a senior U.S. Treasury official gave a speech very similar to this, calling on the IMF and said the IMF was asleep at the wheel in dealing with imbalances. Hank Paulson started the Strategic Economic Dialogue with the Chinese. Every Treasury Secretary since then have had an approach. So how will you do this differently, and how do you think that you'll proceed in this approach? What is your philosophy? What is your tools, and how will you execute on this?
Well, look, I think that our moves toward reordering the financial or trading system is a start. I think that today, as I reaffirm our engagement, but set up a list of core principles and back to basics for the institutions. And again, being from the private sector, we want to see results. And we want to see timelines that, as you and I were talking about backstage, global rebalancing has been a topic for more than 20 years.
Long time.
And it's some countries may have a 100-year perspective. We don't.
Right. China obviously is an important part of this administration's foreign and economic policy. You'll be meeting with your Chinese counterparts. What will you tell them in the sense of how they obviously are aware that there's huge imbalances, their manufacturing capacity is enormous, especially in things like automobiles. How will you help them understand that it's not just about talking, it's about executing?
Well, look, I don't think I have to help them understand. I think they understand very well. And it's just a matter of impetus and will. So I believe I first went to Japan in 1990, 91, within 12 months of the peak of the bubble. A decade of that unwind, a decade of malaise. And then in 2012, I ran across a fellow, 2011, who was running for prime minister named Shinzo Abe, and he knew that Japan needed change and implemented it very quickly. 10 years later, more than 10 years later, Japan has had a remarkable economic run, and I think that our Chinese counterparts that will come to this realization. And if some of our policies, sometimes it takes an external push.
Right.
Alternatively, what I have said previously, there is an opportunity for a big deal here, that the U.S. is looking to rebalance to more manufacturing. The identity of that would be less consumption. If China is serious on less dependence on export-led manufacturing growth and a rebalancing toward a domestic economy, I think they use the term dual circulation. Right. Well, right now it's really singular circulation. And if they want to rebalance, let's do it together. This is an incredible opportunity. And I think if Bridgewater founder Ray Dalio were to write something, he could call it a beautiful rebalancing.
Indeed. But a big part of that will also be our own fiscal imbalance. And as you mentioned, we're running deficit 6% of GDP at the top of the cycle. Not sustainable, as you yourself have pointed out. How important is it to also address our fiscal imbalance as part of this larger rebalancing?
Well, it's very important that I think most people in this room are trained economists, and everyone knows that a trade deficit emanates from three things. External trade policies, which we are intent on addressing. And the external trade policies can be tariffs, non-tariff barriers, currency manipulation, and the state subsidy of labor and means of production. So terms of trade or trade regulation is one. Two is our budget deficit. So the larger our deficit, the more it creates a demand suck, also pushes up the interest rates. And then three, the level of the dollar. The U.S., we continue to have a strong dollar policy, and the dollar will adjust based on markets. Everyone asks me, well, what does a strong dollar mean? And to me, the strong dollar means having the policies in place to deserve capital flows and have confidence. But it doesn't mean that the price on the Bloomberg screen every day. And it also has different meanings in terms of bilateral the prices. So it's really three-pronged. But Tim, to your question, I have talked about we did not get here quickly with this spending. The U.S. does not have a revenue problem. We have a spending problem. And I have suggested when I first met President Trump to talk about joining his campaign 2 years ago that we need to get back to a long-term sustainable budget deficit of something with a 3 in front of it, which works. We have 2% nominal growth or 2% inflation, projected 1.8% growth, which I think could be much higher if we implement our economic policies.
You reaffirmed the strong dollar policy first articulated by Bob Rubin. Valerie Giscard d'Estaing in the 1960s talked about the U.S. exorbitant privilege of the dollar. There are some in this town who question that privilege and actually see it as a burden. Do you see it as a privilege?
That the U.S. sits at the center of the global economy is enabled by the use of dollars, and that it's natural that the usage would come down over time. And I think that the U.S. will always, for my lifetime, be the reserve currency. I actually am not sure that anyone else wants it. I can't remember, one of the European officials said today, maybe it was Mr. de Guindos, I can't remember, said, oh, well, the euro could become a second reserve currency. Well, we've just had a substantial appreciation in the euro. For export economies, it's a lot of pressure. And look, I think that the reaffirming our belief in these international institutions is also part of that.
You mentioned the euro. You mentioned in your comments Mario Draghi's report from last year. There was the letter report. Before that, I've been spending a lot of time in Europe. There does seem to be a much more a buoyant atmosphere in Europe. They see this as an opportunity for them. I said something about a possible renaissance. I was heckled a bit, but I actually am pretty positive on Europe. Do you think this is an opportunity to shift some of that demand? The world has relied on U.S. final demand to shift some of that demand for Europe. Is this a positive time for Europe?
Look, I think it can be. And it wasn't in a straight line. It wasn't always the way a trained diplomat would have done. But I think we should all congratulate President Trump. He has done what a succession of European leaders have tried to do for the past 26 years, since the advent of the euro, that whether it's the French, the Italians, other European countries have tried to get Germany to increase their fiscal spend and drive the European economy. And that I applaud these nascent efforts because it's a combination. It's a combination of economic stimulus, and it is a combination of burden sharing on the European continent for defense. And as I've said many times before, economic security is national security is economic security. So if this European plan works, that I applaud it. I had a private meeting with the Spanish finance minister last week, 2 weeks ago, and he said, you're going to be pleasantly surprised with where we go on military spending, and that this 2% number today, he was right.
Yeah. So you're already taking on these tasks. You have China, more consumption, less investment, deal with their manufacturing excess capacity. Europe is a great opportunity. The U.S. rebalancing here, including on fiscal. So what do you want the IMF to do? What would you like to hear from Kristalina over the next couple of days, or the board, in the new direction, again, back to factory settings direction? What do you want to hear from them?
Well, again, I think it's just been mission creep.
Yeah.
And just occasionally you have to trim your garden when the weeds grow. And I think that it's back to basics. What are our priorities, and how are we going to judge success?
And the World Bank, you discussed about graduating the medium-sized countries that should have graduated some time ago. That changes the commercial model of the World Bank, but obviously you think that's important, that they need to be graduated.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, it's just, as President Trump says, it's common sense that you can't have the second largest economy in the world. And it's as I said in my speech, I applaud their rapid growth, but you don't get both. I have a teenager who sometimes wants to be treated like a child, sometimes wants to be treated like an adult, and
yeah. I got one of those too.
Yeah, and it's an adult economy.
You mentioned energy, specifically nuclear, during the campaign, and since you've become secretary, you've talked about energy production is one of your important legs. The U.S. produces about 13 million barrels of oil a day, the largest producer in the world. What more do we need to do here, and how can the World Bank, what do they need to do more to encourage fossil fuels as well as nuclear, and I assume all the above?
Yeah, look, the sine qua non for economic growth is energy abundance. And we need to drive the right combination of the crawl, walk, run for these countries in terms of sustainable production. But by sustainable, I mean robust and baseload,
right.
Not what I would call almost a luxury belief that we have in the West. Like they are worried about pumping water. They are worried about heating their homes, running their hospitals, and we've seen that the intermittency doesn't work. Even kind of in middle developed countries, maybe like South Africa, that seems to have rolling blackouts.
Right.
So that's not a model. We want to have a model of strong baseload and then bolting on the alternative production, as opposed to beginning with alternative production and then having this latency or intermittency that makes it impossible to industrialize.
In the final minute or two, let me just turn to financial intermediation. There's a famous adage that capitalism without capital is just another ism. The institutions you see here are important intermediaries, both in the capital markets and in other forms of financial intermediation. What is your vision, especially for the U.S., in terms of financial regulation? What do you want the industry to look like? Obviously, the capital markets, the U.S. is a crown jewel of this economy. How should we encourage that, not only here, but abroad?
Well, I think that I've been getting a lot of questions on private credit, and I think that private credit is an interesting addition to the U.S. mosaic, and it is the depth and breadth of our capital and credit markets that powers the U.S. economy, and it's the innovation there. I think that private credit's a very new and interesting part, but it is happening outside of the regulated ecosystem.
Right.
And I always like to say I'm not an economist, I'm an economic historian, and I think that is a distortion of the system, and it tells me that the post-2008 regulatory corset is too tight on the regulated institutions, and we want to deregulate them or make them more able to provide the opportunity to lend to the American economy and perhaps into the international economy in a smart, safe, and sound way. As we've seen, the history of financial crises is a overreaction on one side, and I think that we had a regulatory overreaction. I convened something in the US called FSOC, the Financial Stability Oversight Council, which convenes the regulators, and I think through partnership with the 3 US banking regulators, Federal Reserve, Controller of the Currency, and the FDIC, we can come up with a system that makes the regulated financial system prosper again. And what the US has that is different than most other G7 countries is just the number of financial institutions. We don't have 5 big banks, 3 big banks. And in the US, the community and small banks, which are provide 70% of agricultural lending, 40% of small business lending, 40% of real estate lending. And in the US, we've had this incredible boom on Wall Street. I think Wall Street can continue doing well. But I think it's Main Street's turn to share in the prosperity, and I think it was the pullback by the small banks, the post the GFC, that's kind of created this stagnation on Main Street, and we're determined to fix that.
Mr. Secretary, I always say Treasury is the sober voice of reason. What we've heard today from you is a sober voice of reason. We wish you all the best. Ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause for Treasury Secretary.